Hello to everyone. So glad you could join us here. This is a really exciting program for us because it's only been recently that we even realized that Max Cade had done some in-depth experiments in his meditation classes with the stroboscope. We'll call it the strobe. And of course, there had been experiments before by other people, which is what no doubt caught his attention. And today, the strobe is being used, wouldn't say widely because I'm not sure what's going on with every single manufacturer, but Vilistus has had an interest. Steve Clark has developed a strobe for someone. And then Paul Gerry, our guest, also is either about to, or he will apprise us, already has developed a strobe. And so this is archival territory for us. So we find out what Max did, and then also, no doubt, we'll have some scientific information about what the strobe can accomplish, what it's used for. And so welcome, all of you. First, I'd like to welcome Neil Hancock, who's joining us from California. Neil is the nephew of Geoff Blundell, who was the co-inventor of the first mind mirror back in 1976. And Neil himself did a wonderful service for us by developing the software for the Mind Mirror 3, which is the direct ancestor of the Mind Mirror we're using now. And then also a warm welcome to Peter Staples, who also is in the UK with our other two guests. And Peter was also, like Neil, in some of Max's early classes. And if not a lot of them, we'll find out more about that. And also, like Neil, intimately involved in technical developments of a variety of different meters that were used by Max and Isabel and Peter all through the years. So we look forward to some of this historical information from Peter, and no doubt technical as well. And then our third guest is Paul Gerry, who is a neurophysiologist in the UK. He has done a lot of work with sleep studies, and seems now that he is sort of moving in a new direction with the development of the strobe and some work of his own. And so we really look forward to hearing about that. And then last, but certainly not least, Steve Clark, also in the UK, who is the co-owner of Vilistus and Durham Systems Management, which manufactures the equipment that the Mind Mirror 6 runs on. And Steve worked closely with Neil Hancock to make sure that we had the most wonderful Mind Mirror that is just so advanced and does so many things for us and continues to advance all the time. So welcome to our four guests, and also to all of you who are tuned in today. I know that some of you have had some experience with the strobe, like Garth Fisher, who's with us, and we'll have some, no doubt, some comments and some questions. He's also very technically oriented from way back with early biofeedback machines. Happy to have you all here, and thank you for being here as well. I thought we would start with Neil, because he sat in the classes and knows a pretty good bit about Geoff's development, enhancement and development of the strobe that Max used. He sent me early on a paper that was written by Geoff Blundell titled "Rhythmic Light and the Flicker of Consciousness" back in 1997. So Neil, anything you want to tell us, everything you want to tell us, we look forward to hearing from you.
Well, yes. Well, thank you for that introduction and introducing everybody else. I've got to say, first of all, I'm an electronic engineer, so I'm not knowledgeable about the usages and everything else. I say that a lot in different forums because when I'm doing things, because that's my skill. I enjoy creating some of the instruments. So I'm going back 40 years to when I was in London with Max and doing some classes. And am I muted? No, I'm not. Okay. No. So just a little mute came up on the screen. It was a wonderful base. I did these classes with Max, and part of them, my uncle Geoff was there, and he said, why don't you come along to these classes? I had been involved in some meditation. And it was a wonderful base. It really gave me a good base for being able to go out into the world, and with all the different ways things were going on. One of the aspects was the strobe, and I just dusted one off from my cupboard. Let's take off my background. You'll see my messy office in here, but this was one of the first strobes that I think Geoff did, a simple flashlight with an on-off button and a variable frequency. And it's had the same battery in it for 20 years. So it's the basic, I don't know how well it comes out. It seems to come out quite well from what I can see of it. And I just took some snips this morning of some pictures, and let's see if that works. Basically, it's this, this is from the brochure that they had, the initial one that was there. And then they came out, and Geoff describes the process, came out with a bigger strobe. So that was a 3 foot by 3 foot strobe. And I do have a picture of it. So the therapeutic strobe was this bigger package. You can just see it there. 3 foot by 3 foot. And Max, that was the ones that I saw in Max's classes, was this big one. And the process was that we would do the meditations. We would do what we were coming for, and sort of in the biofeedback side, where Max was really teaching from his Zen side, but also taking notes and using his experience as a physicist and researching the physiological effects, essentially. But that wasn't at all visible in the class. We were just doing that. And one of these effects was you'd been meditating or going through the guided meditations that Max had done, and the big strobe would come out. And if nobody objected to its usage, or, it was done quite carefully, I think, but we'd pull the lights down in the class in North Hampstead and London, and then they'd bring out the strobe, and we would all look at it perhaps for 5 minutes, and we'd start describing what did we see, and I remember this very one discussion where somebody described some horses galloping in from the left. And so a lot of people, including me in the class, we saw these horses. So it was an auto-suggestion, I think. And again, I'm not too sure on the technical language, but this is just my experience of it. But there was this process, perhaps, of empathy. I mean, it's always been a research project, I think, with the mind mirror, at least, just what are the empathetic linkages with people? Can you actually see those empathetic linkages with the mind mirror patterns? But there was a description. We did get to see the way that in the class, and Geoff describes it much more in his paper that I found just recently and stuff. Is that a reasonable introduction? I don't want to spend too much time or hog it. Seems like there's an awful lot of good people here who've got experiences, probably more than I have. But that was the for me at least, was an initial sort of introduction. And
yeah, that sounds good. I have a few questions. When Max introduced the strobe, were your eyes closed? People were meditating with their eyes closed?
We'd come out of guided meditations. Often for me, a very nice one was the green man going underground and finding places and going in an exploration, and just you opened a door that was in the unconscious somewhere, and then what came out. So it was often that process, and then it was just open your eyes. I don't think there was any strong direction. If you wanted to do it with closed eyes, it was probably all right, but it was a darkened room. Geoff was still working with the range of frequencies and the pattern of frequencies. I think that's something that Geoff was really fine-tuning or customizing or exploring. Just what was the change in patterns of the frequencies? Did you start off with the really slow, which helped people, but you don't want too much of that, and then some form of variation and patterns to kind of get you to to see something. So a slow sort of like change in patterns. But with the eyes open, eyes closed, I'm not too sure. I don't think there was any strict direction on that.
Were some or many of the people hooked up to the mind mirror at the time?
You know, typically there would have been just one person on a mind mirror, I think. Really, it was more innocuous. It was, could you be on a mind mirror and not pay attention to it? So it was really what Max and Isabel were able to use to calibrate what was going on in somebody's head, or what was going on. And if there was something interesting on the mind mirror, the discussion usually was, well, now would everybody open their eyes except for so-and-so, and then whoever the person was, it was, could they hold the pattern for whatever was going on with them? So in the quietened room, I don't think it was much of a discussion, because the attention really was, as a group, was on the light. And so the mind mirror was, I think, as a monitoring instrument. You know, did it show up on anything for somebody? Was somebody getting into a pattern? I think Geoff describes in his paper somebody who he suggests had a petite mole. I don't really know the context very much while this was going on, but it was a very pleasant experience for that person in the way they described it.
There's something in the paper about that where someone did have, I think they fell out, if I remember correctly. They just collapsed, and they said, oh, it must have been an epileptic seizure, and took them to the hospital, and they pronounced the person okay. And then they came, to Max's surprise, came straight back into the class for more. So
I think that was another situation. But the one that Geoff describes in his paper on the flickering strobe is more somebody who describes it as, with the light, they just went with it, and that for a period of time, they were very quiet. You know, they just, or went there, so to speak. But when they were still in the class. So I think the classes, you know, as safe places, and certainly for me, the class, the context was, you were in North London. I cycled up there. You were in a safe setting for a period of time. It was winter that was coming. And this was just sort of, gathering round and exploring some inner states. And those weren't the words that we used, but that was what was going on. And the strobe came out for some small period at the end before the class changed to, general connections, ended, I suppose.
Yeah, and so this paper says that Max believed that the strobe promoted relaxation and used it for self-discovery, and that there was some kind of radar that was common to the people in the room, thus explaining the galloping horses, and also that it did stimulate the awakened mind pattern. So I was just wondering, did you yourself have any particular experiences or sensations that maybe it was relaxing? Or
I've definitely used it since then, more in the smaller variety, that I've had a lot of stress. It's had a just being there, being able to sit quietly, really not in the last 15 years, but previous to that, I used it as a way of just sort of having a visual overload that was pleasant for me, just staring as sort of more of an induction of an, I mean, I don't know the real terminology for this, but an alpha state of some sort. But this, because the visual side is so connected with our brain, just sitting there and being quiet with a flashing light, playing with the frequencies, just varying the frequency slightly, I would describe it definitely as relaxing. Within the classes, it was used, I mean, I'm not talking about a lot of sessions that I went to, but it was used as more of an empathetic, as an exploration of language and exploration of common experience. What was the language that you could bring up for what you were seeing? And I think the understanding is that it's more that there's some sort of perceptual arrangement happening. You've got the visual stimulation that is red because of the historical association with fire, and sitting around a flickering fire, and that there is this sort of empathetic connection with the others in the group. So in that very safe group, that was certainly something that I experienced at that point.
You know, I was interested by some of the speculations in this paper of Geoff's, where he was saying that Max was assuming that the stimulation of the visual cortex, since that is connected to all parts of the brain, was actually also stimulating the brain stem, and that was perhaps what had to do with if not the radar-like empathy, but maybe something to do with more of a collective consciousness, or because of that. Yeah,
it's a fascinating area, and I guess that's for the physiologists to work through. Is that the right terminology? But I mean, I think part of the thing is just what is the experience, and perhaps where are the edges with that experience. I know I've tried to be very careful. My wife really doesn't like the strobe, and we've sort of tried it. So there's some groups of people who are I don't want to be part of this. And I guess it's best to honor that. And
of course, in the 1960s, we all loved it. I mean, this was central to Hippieville, right? A strobing light, a whole Inagata Davida mindset.
Right. Well, with movement and stuff, yeah, with the dancing and everything. And I find the therapeutic side very different than a sort of mechanical dance floor side. So I'm very much, when it's in for me personally, when it's a public situation, I don't find that very, very beneficial. When it's, the sort of the disco dance type thing, I tend to orientate myself away from wherever there's a source of flashing lights. Personally, that's the way I find.
Oh. Well, I should take you to some of the trance dances down in Louisiana. You might change your mind.
Well, now trance dances, around a fire, that could be something, where the purpose is more of to have that dance. And a trance, particularly a trance dance with the movement, when you get into that, where you get into more of the breathing side. I certainly had some experiences with that's separate. And
sounds like a subject we could explore at some point. Well, how about you, Peter? Did you have any direct experiences that would be interesting to report, or can you just tell us what you know about how Max and Geoff were using, or Isabel and you were using the strobe in classes or otherwise?
Yeah. I'll just give you about the format. The Max and Isabel did classes that were like 5 weekly sessions, and typically they'd start maybe late September, so there'd be a couple before Christmas and then at least a couple after that, and then there wouldn't be any in the summer. And they would be topics, so it's kind of like people new to it would go on the part 1, and that would be, so it's 5 evenings, like typically about 6:30 to kind of 8:45, something like that, although they also did one in the afternoon. So you might have like a Monday afternoon, a Monday evening, Tuesday evening, Wednesday evening, Thursday evening. Sometimes there were weekend ones as well. And so there was a kind of format. And after Max died, then I did these. So Isabel kept doing them, and she had loads of. She had an article in one of the national papers. I think it was the Telegraph, half page, and basically just saying what she'd done. And it was kind of along the lines of continuing the stuff she'd done with Max. But what it meant was there were a lot of people came. And so there were a lot of new classes on there. Class would hold maybe about 10 people. They're all done in this. By that time, there'd always been a bit of a problem with finding spaces. And really you needed a dedicated room because there was so much kit around. So this was kind of like almost like a cellar, really. You'd go in, there's a pathway up the side of the house, and you go in, and that would be a room that was kind of self-contained. The walls are all painted white, and there was like a U shape of desks, and each desk would have an ESR and a temperature, definitely. And there was about 5 mind mirrors, and there was strobes and some other EEGs and various other gadgets as well. And so Max would sit at the end, and Isabel would typically help people getting wired up and this kind of thing. And so he was the one running the course. Anyway, after Max died, these carried on. I did them with Isabel for quite a while. There's another stage on the strobe, actually. The little one that Neil was going, by the time I'd got there, it was kind of like a toy, really. And there was, this would be early 80s. There was one that was about a bit more than a foot cube. And I think it was probably designed as a disco dance floor strobe in a box. And basically, it was in a steel box with a red filter gel on the front. And it just had a single control, which was the frequency. And so that was the first one I had experience of in the class. And basically, the person operating it, really, it was at their discretion how they varied the frequency. So they were just manually turning this knob. But broadly, it would be used kind of in the delta theta alpha range. And with something like that, typically you'd start more in the alpha stuff. What you'd find with this is, as it gets slower, it's more likely to have starker impact, partly because it's going into the lower frequencies, and also the flash is more stark, if you like, when there are bigger gaps between them. And then the therapeutic strobe, unfortunately, none of Geoff, he never seemed to put dates on any of his publications. So none of the handbooks actually have dates, but I think it was probably about 83 or something. I can remember when it was introduced to the class. And the way the big one worked was that you had a control box, and the control box basically had programs on it which varied the change in the intensity of the flash and the frequency. So there were there's two things, if you like. One is, the way it worked was it had a fluorescent tube which was excited by a coil. And what you could do with that is basically cause the fluorescent to fire on. You know, like when a fluorescent's playing up, you get this kind of irritating flashy thing when the bulb's about to go, or the starter's bust or something like that. Well, what you can do is basically induce the thing to fire, and that's the way this therapeutic strobe worked. And that meant you could vary the period in which it was on. In other words, the duration of the flash relative to the gap. And you could also vary the frequency. So if you like, there were two control oscillators which would vary the pattern with which this thing was firing. So one of them would be varying the frequency, and the other one the intensity. And another thing on this, the way that worked originally, it had I think there were 3 preset programs, and then there was a manual one where you have controls on the box where you could vary the frequency of the rate at which it went up and down, and the rate at which the intensity varied yourself. There was actually a later model which had a different hand. So the strobe unit itself, the flash unit, was the same, but it had a different control box, and it had there was more kind of logic and less controls on it, so it had kind of push buttons. I think Geoff had probably developed that because it was cheaper to reproduce. You know, the problem with the boxes with a lot of controls is they are actually quite expensive to manufacture. Anyway, so that would be the kind of way we do it. And on, let's say, a 5-week course, I remember it's week 3 where we introduced the strobe. The courses originally geared much more around nervous system response, like limbic, rather than the brain rhythm cortical stuff. So, you know, that was central to it. In fact, when Max started, he was interested in that aspect of relaxation. I think originally what fired it was experimenting to see with hypnosis, how much of the success was down to the level of relaxation of the client or patient, how much it was down to the nature of the suggestion. And what he found was that it was getting the deep relaxation was really what was going to cause things to be most efficacious. So that was kind of where the original kind of course type scenario was set up. And what Max had done, you see, he realized he could actually do this as a class rather than with individuals one-to-one. And that's really where it changed. So and the way that would work is everybody in the class would have the instruments on, and they'd be, say at the beginning of the class, you'd be asked to get the needle on the ESR moving. So one of the most important things is to actually be able to change things. The most difficult people to work with is where nothing moves at all, and it's like everything is fixed. But even with those, you'd find by week 3 with the strobe, it would get a lot of people who were having trouble moving this thing. You'd find you were getting a release in the autonomic nervous system. So, all that would be in effect subconscious, but I guess what the strobe was doing was inducing more of a kind of alpha theta type response. And that was causing the, higher brain, if you like, to let go a bit of its hold, its grasp on the autonomic nervous system. And that original, for the initial ones, we tend to keep it more around the alpha theta stuff. But after week 3, there was always a session with the strobe in there. And as Neil was saying, you would darken the room. Well, that wasn't too onerous because there was only windows at one end, and it was often nighttime by then anyway. So there was no problem with doing that. And you might, you both ask the people to have their eyes closed, and you might also do it open. And if you have your eyes closed, what's happening, you've in effect introduced another kind of red filter. So it's kind of like the eyelids in effect putting another level of filter more like in the kind of ready area. But what it means is you can, you've got more control, self-control of the level of the impact. It's like if you're finding it a bit much, if you just close your eyes a bit, or you can do that. If you do that, you're still going to get the light because this stuff's all over the room. So the flash from this thing is basically going to bounce all around. The walls are all white on this room, so it's going to bounce all around the place anyway. And so it's kind of like initially, I guess people don't really have a very good way of contextualizing it. And it's kind of there for the experience. And that's one reason why you're maybe asking them, well, what did you see? Did you see this? It's always trying to get an awareness of a subjective awareness of a change where you've got some kind of measurable correlate, which they can then hook onto. If you like that, I mean, the baseline, if you like, of all this training is really teaching responses. And the idea is if somebody becomes aware of it, then they can access that more readily without needing all these bits of equipment and being guided into it and all that kind of thing. So that's kind of where the model was. But what you'd find is it's a bit hard to explain if you haven't seen this. It's kind of like what you're seeing is lights, almost like colors, a bit like when you see like petrol, a drop of petrol on a puddle. You've got this sort of fine coating, but it's kind of a bit ephemeral. It's like you're looking through it, but it's got these really bright colors. And so what you're not seeing like solid opaque color. What you're seeing is all manner of almost phantom color, if you like. The color's there, but it's not like this is something with this color. It's more like here's all colors within my field of vision, within my mind, kind of thing. And that's where, and because it doesn't have a content, you see, it's right for the individual to generate content, which is what they're probably going to do when they see the stuff. So that's kind of the context of this, and people would love the strobe. They oh yeah, you've got this. Maybe they think they don't have to do any work for that bit. So again, it gets a whole group. There's a kind of anticipation after you've had this a couple of times. You go, oh, yeah, we've got the strobe now. That's great, this sort of thing. So that's kind of the context. There was. In terms of, we did some courses more specifically on creativity, like if we did one where you're trying to help people get into that kind of egg. I think you call it something else. You call it diamond, something like that. Anyway, and the one in Awaken Mind, it's called kind of creativity. And what we'd find on that is that if you direct the course in that way, then people seem to latch onto it anyway. But things like the strobe are very helpful for that, because it does, it kind of fires up the brain to work more coherently, if you like, the two hemispheres and the whole thing, which is kind of part of the nature of that sort of state. And also because you're, with a guided imagery, you're directing a line of what somebody has to be visualizing. But with pure strobe, without that, you're not. They are basically providing a content or whatever, which is personal to them, which again is kind of going to help induce a more creative state, if you like, because it's not one in which you're being told what to do. You're finding it yourself. Questions?
That's wonderful. Really helpful too. What did they say besides, oh boy, the strobe? Did people have these kind of collective consciousness experiences like Neil mentioned with the galloping horses, or was it unique to everyone, each experience?
I can't say that I recall very much of people describing a joint experience that wasn't in some way related to something that had been done already. In other words, where there was already a context there. What it does, it promotes, and we had quite a good empathy in the group anyway, but it kind of promotes an empathy, because you're sort of, that's a bit odd, isn't it? You're kind of sharing, you're putting a subjective cover on something which is a shared, external experience, sensory experience, and you're all there together, kind of thing, and there is a kind of group context to it. I can't say really we got into whether people were coming up with the same imagery. That wasn't really what we're about. Oh, there's one other thing I would say. The way the mind mirrors tended to work is you would, in say, like in this format of a 5-week course, everybody would get at least one session on the mind mirror. There was, within a group which should take 10, maybe 12 at a real pinch, you might get in there. There was at least 3 mind mirrors in use. There were actually 5. I think there were two mind mirror 1s and 3 mind mirror 2s, and potentially they're all in use, although it can take a bit of time setting the things up. And so the class is not, for the most part, geared around what individuals are producing on the mind mirror. You can get some of that, but when somebody is showing something which is kind of distinct or useful, it might be helpful as feedback to them, or it might just be helpful for feedback to the group to explain, look what's happening here, blah, 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 and you get someone to maybe explain what they're doing, and that relates to it. And the way the mind mirror is set, I think it's possibly a little bit different to the way you use them in your programs. It's quite a bit is about what is specifically going on at that point in time. So somebody's just doing something and you see the lines go out on the, left brain theta or something like that. So you might just say, oh, what's that? because what you're trying to do is get them aware of that something has just happened and kind of tie up the impression with the objectivity of the mind mirror, that sort of thing. But
Peter, yeah, I'm just wondering, when the mind mirrors when the strobe, when the context was changed to the strobe,
yeah,
what was the introduction to it, or what was how was the class and formed? Was there any suggestion given? Did you guys give any suggestions to the class what to do, or was it just, here is the time for strobe and say what you see, or what was the intro to it?
The way the class works is there would be a mix of informatory explanation about some topic or other. With Max, quite a bit of transpersonal and Eastern stuff. But then there would be guided imageries, and there would be sessions where you're working directly with the instruments. So if there were, let's say, a guided imagery prior to the session with the strobe, then that we might well use, as leading the group, I might well use that as a suggestion for where their mind might be illustrating content, sort of thing, something like that, or just what else it might bring up, says, but that is contextualized in a way. Yeah, it would be.
Right. So
I wouldn't. Sorry. Yeah.
What I remember from the classes was just that people, either because they'd done it before, but they would start talking about it because you've got an inward experience beforehand, and now you're focused, on an outward experience with the larger strobe when that was being used. And so there was something going on that was an outward part of the group. And I know, at least from what I remember, there wasn't a lot of discussion about what to do with it, but people would start volunteering, I think, what they were seeing with it. So it was a switch from an inner side, I think, an inner part before the strobe. And then once the strobe was in there, it was towards the end in the classes I went to.
They get talkative. Yeah. Well, because when you remember, if you've got a group of, 10, 12 people, you can't afford to have too much everybody chipping in the experience, unless that is broadly what the class is about. And they're mostly not about using the strobe. That's just one aspect of it.
Right. I'm just thinking, when that context was switched to the strobe, purely to the strobe, was that a period that you thought in the classes? I mean, what did you think it was being used for?
What I think it was being, as a group leader, it was basically helping them access different, particularly two hemispheres firing together, but also, because what the thing's doing is taking you through sequences of delta and theta and alpha, and you'll typically see that kind of stuff on the mind mirror patterns. So the mind mirror patterns would be there. I mean, the lights would be off, but with the red light ones, they all show up anyway. It's partly just where you're sitting, you're actually able to see what's on the mind mirror screens, and also if you want to freeze it, whether you're within range of a freeze lead or something like that kind of thing. It's probably about the only thing in the class where there is an element of entrainment from the instruments. It was just that. Yeah, it wasn't really Max's thing, but the strobe was different, because it's not like you're just directly inducing a faster EEG rate or slower one or something by applying electrical voltage to the head or some weird thing like that. It's that you're providing a stimulus which is some way removed from what the brain's doing. Oh, actually, another bit to do with the red as well. Unless I'm mistaken, I think it's like this. With the cones in the eye, in the retina, I think the blues respond to blue, and the ones of the other colors, they respond to the ones above them. So as the red's the lowest frequency, it responds to the blues and the greens. and it's up to the brain to untangle the stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So they're not, in other words, they're not bandpass filters closely. It's more like that you're getting the whole spectrum on the red cones. So for the red ones, the brain, both in the eye, I guess, and in the cortex, is having to do the most work to try and make sense of the signal. I think that was the reason Geoff gave anyway as to why the red was the color to be used for this.
Actually, in our retina, 64% of our cones respond to red, and then 32 respond to green, and only 2% respond to blue. And the blue ones are more peripheral, so the red ones are the central cones. So most of our responses are from our red responding photoreceptors, if that makes any more sense.
Good reason to use red, yes.
It kind
Is this the time to open it up to what other people are exploring? I mean, I'm personally interested in where it's gone and what other people are doing, but I'll leave it up to, I don't know whether that's what you intended, Judith.
Well, what Paul said kind of complicates something in terms of this understanding that we got from Anna Wise, was that red and orange light relate to beta, and green and yellow to alpha, and blue and purple to theta, and violet light and even white to delta. So I think, Paul, you're basically saying that, I don't know if you're saying that everyone has a different proportion of colored cones and thus would respond to light in different ways, or is this a universal kind of visual ratio of tones and colors, and people would respond same or differently?
Well, unless you're red-green colorblind, then you do have that proportion of the different color responses. And the main thing is, in bright light, when our cones are working, we can send signals to the brain up to about 60 images a second. Whereas if you're in the dark and your rods are working, they only work up to about 20 images a second. So there's this two separate systems. So the blues tend to be slower frequency than the reds.
But
Okay,
I think in terms of like,
really.
yeah, what Geoff was describing, and I think on this is there's a physical association with the way it impacts the brain in some way, and that's the red. But I think in terms of the frequencies, I'm not too sure. My guess is it's more of a trying to associate it with something rather than a direct physical, more of a, I'm going to just use the word metaphysical because I don't really know, but more of a model description for how you relate to something rather than a physical impact on the brain. I don't know if that makes...
I always understood Anna was talking about the subjective experience of colors rather than the actual physiology of rods and cones and how the lights were affecting us. So when you see blue, it generally subjectively is associated with theta, but not necessarily a blue light would create theta.
Yeah, I would have thought that too, except that you have interior decorators choosing colors that if red are more arousing and if blue are cooler and tend to have a calmer effect. So there must be some link between, and this opens up a whole thing I don't know that we want to get into, but in Geoff's paper, he said that he, in one of the meditations that he was experiencing, saw red light, and that no red light had been used in the strobe. And yet someone who was sitting, and more than one someone who was sitting near him, also saw red. So it's more complex than I want to try to figure out, but it may just be that whether the eyes are open or closed, that particular color bands operate in certain frequencies that have effect on brain waves. I'll throw this to the experts. Okay, then maybe we won't go there.
I would just hazard a guess that, you know, there's perception side of things, perceptive filters, and that there is some intersection there between red, knowing that it's red used in the strobes, and then what patterns people see, and maybe if anything comes up from that that's not red, it's a perceptive. But I'm not too sure that, you know, the 60% red of the reaction from the things, I think they were just monitoring, what they were seeing was that the red was the most effective in somehow communicating with these other parts of the parts of the brain, and that was stimulating effectively. Again, I'm just guessing a little bit here, but stimulating the perceptive side, and then it was the perceptive side that was being explored.
Complex subjects here. So Neil, I heard you say that you're interested in what's happening today. So let me just open this up. Peter, I expect you have the same interest. What can you, Steve Clark and Paul Gerry, each in turn or back and forth, tell us about the current uses of the strobe?
Okay, if I go first, just to say that I use strobe lighting in my clinical work every day. And that started back in the early 70s when I actually went and met Gray Walter and to get a frequency analyzer from that he'd built, which was an analog analyzer, because I worked in psychiatry then, and I noticed that when I was doing photic stimulation to look for signs of epilepsy, certain frequencies tended to relax the psychiatric patients more than others. So that I found that was fascinating from there. And now, many, many years later, a lot of my work's done in measuring the eye's response to different colors and frequencies of light, and how it then sends it through the optic nerve back to the visual cortex. So it all kind of fits in very well with this side. But probably the best thing to do, first of all, is to say that if we are using flashing lights, there is this slight worry about setting off a seizure. And the color which is most likely to set off a seizure is red. And also if it's a pattern red or behind a grating. And there's two types of response which is abnormal to a flashing light that you might notice. Tends to be when you're flashing a light between 10 and 20 flashes a second. And one's called a photomyoclonic response, where it makes the muscles twitch. And you can get just slight feeling of twitchiness, or it can actually produce quite jerking of the arms and things. And that's in a patient that doesn't have epilepsy. And the chance of provoking a full-blown seizure in someone without epilepsy is about 0.5%. So very small. In someone with epilepsy, it's only about 3%. So it's quite small. I'd always say if anyone is using flashing lights is to look at the raw trace, especially looking at occipital channels, and look for any spikes coming up when they're doing the flashing lights, which are at a different rate from the flash to the photic responses that you pick up. So if you're stimulating at, say, 10 flashes a second, you might notice on my mirror presentation that you're picking up a good response at 10, which is the photic response. But you may get 5 and 20 and even 30. You may get harmonics coming up as well. But just look out for any spikes, especially if you turn the light off and they continue. Then don't do it again.
We have had people go into spasm watching the strobe, definitely. One guy I remember, and what we do, Isabel was always very astute at keeping an eye on everybody while it was on. And if she saw anything out of the order, you know, she'd speak to them and I'll just stop it. And I know a few people, particularly people who are actually creative, artistic, and they just find it all too much. They just say, no, I won't. You know, maybe initially they might have had some experience where they just felt it was totally out of their control and it wasn't somewhere they wanted to go, and they would just leave the room then. But one guy, I remember one instance, he was but fortunately sitting almost next to me, and his jaw kind of, all closed up and clamped up. And we were worried he was going to bite his tongue. And, so he'd really just gone into it like a totally tensed up spasm state. Fortunately, we saw it and we were there at the time, but it just brought home that is something which, there is a chance can happen. And the only in that kind of context, particularly where it's not a one-to-one, you basically just have to be aware of it, and tell people, if you feel anything, like it's getting out of control for you, then don't just sit there, just don't close your eyes or turn away. Yeah. So that is with the therapeutic stuff, because it's so big and all encompassing. Yeah. Sorry, Paul.
So I have had patients who've never had a seizure, and I've used a large flashing light, about 30-degree angle, subtended angle from the eyes, and they've had a seizure within about 2 seconds of flashing lights in their eyes. So it tends to be all or nothing.
Yeah. But it is a real possibility,
Oh yes, definitely. Yeah. If I was going to use it, I'd just get some kind of disclaimer that signed before I did it.
Yeah, well, quite honestly, it would make me wary of marketing a device like the therapeutic strobe, just because things have changed a bit since the 80s.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean you couldn't have a device that was much less likely to do that. Part of the thing is also the abruptness of the flash. I find, like the one Neil had, because that uses a flashlight bulb, an old type filament bulb, it can't flash on and on that quickly. The bulb has got a warm-up time. And with that one, what you tend to do is hold it right up in front of your face like this kind of thing. But it wouldn't, I've never known anyone have a problem like that with it, because it just doesn't have that impact. So that's possibility.
Certainly with LEDs, you can ramp the intensity up and down, so it kind of envelopes it sort of emulates exactly what you were talking about, Peter. It doesn't come on very fast and it goes off and then repeats.
Yeah. I would think you pretty much remove the main problem if you do it that way. I'm not saying someone would go to spasm with it, but because again, it's kind of it's right totally in your face, isn't it? But do you have any experience of that, Stephen, using the LED ones?
Well, I've used AVE equipment for years, and obviously that's glasses with AVEs in them.
Yeah.
And we have done a fair amount of work, because my business partner's background before we got into EEG in quantity was actually as an LED engineer for displays within places like Selfridges. So he would do, for example, the Clinique stand and just bathe it in light. So we've got a fair amount of experience in using LEDs. And what we've tried to do over the past few years is tie the LED back to the EEG, because it's all very well driving a particular frequency, but if you've got no way of actually correlating that to what's going on, it's what I would choose to call a sort of feed forward technology, where you're just hoping, assuming that you want to produce a particular event or a particular dominant frequency, you're hoping that you're moving there. Whereas by providing the feedback loop and adjusting the flash rate in real time, you can move the the dominant frequency by baby steps, up or down, depending which way you want to go.
So if you used a sine wave rather than a square wave?
I would never use a square wave. I call that an attack wave. It's far too harsh. A sine wave, the worst I would go to would be a sawtooth. But yes, we use a perfect sine wave.
That's good. Yeah.
But then Stephen, you're then tying it into measured frequencies on the brain. You're saying that if you're picking up, and how do you configure that? How do you?
Well, for example, you may say you want to put yourself, let's say, in an alpha state, for the sake of example, and you choose, I don't know, 10 hertz, whatever it is. So you would take an EEG reading, obviously in real time. You would detect what the dominant frequency was from the previous second or whatever, and let's assume it was 16 hertz. So instead of trying to sort of entrain people to 10 immediately, you'd put someone at 15 hertz, wait for the dominant frequency to reduce, then bring it down slowly. And that seems to have a decent effect. There was a study done generally in terms of ABE. Obviously, we've got the audio, we've got the visual, and we've got the binaural beat. What David Vernon at Canterbury found when he did this research 5-6 years ago now is that 75% of the effect of ABE was actually visual.
The flicker, you mean the light?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The flickering light was the thing that actually produced the majority of the entrainment. So it was about 20% from, I mean, it was a fairly large study. I mean, I suspect he just went out and got some students. So that's generally how professors seem to do research these days. Just go and grab a few willing victims. So I don't know the makeup of that particular set of people, but what it appears would be 3/4 would be the visual, about 20% would be audio, and then there was a bit of binaural beat entrainment, but it was a minimum rather than the maximum.
Steve,
Yeah.
if you're using audio, would you do the same sort of stepwise entrainment?
Oh, absolutely, yes. I mean, you would want to entrain the same dominant frequency, both in terms of the light and the sound. So you may have a carrier wave, I don't know, let's say 220 hertz in this side and 230 in there, and you have the binaural beat of 10, but you would also pulse the the stereo at 10 hertz, for example. So you'd get essentially three. You get the light, you get the strobe effect of the sound, and you'd also get the binaural beat, all going at a particular frequency, 15 hertz or whatever.
Great.
So you would try and relate keep the visual and the audio, the beat audio, sort of roughly in together?
Not roughly, exactly together.
Okay.
This might be a good place for you to say something, Steve, about the use of EMDR.
Okay, so one of the things that we're working on at the moment, obviously, and it's quite timely given the withdrawal of US and UK forces from Afghanistan, is we're doing a fair amount of work now with PTSD victims, and quite a few of them are military. One of the things that we're working with, one of the groups we're working with, a couple of ex-military nurses who use EMDR to try and deprogram the PTSD. And we've got essentially two things that we're working on. One is a sort of standard T-bar, which sits about a sort of meter away from you or whatever, a yard away from you. But the other one, which is, I think, more of interest here, is a set of glasses which do three things. One is it can do the EMDR sweep, left and right or round and about or whatever. It can also pulse at a particular color at a particular rate. So for example, and I think Paul is going to mention this at some point about this whole research going on with Alzheimer's, and particular flash rates and particular colors seem to have a beneficial effect on early stage Alzheimer's. So there's that. And then there's the whole kind of trippy experience you can get with ABE, where you have multiple flashing lights, multiple colors simultaneously, and it all sort of blows your mind. And as you sort of close your eyes, what tends to happen is, because you've got random patterns appearing on the eyelids, the brain, trying to make sense of that, begins to give you its own patterns. So platonic solids, for example, and then gives you a whole sort of hypnagogic experience, which leads me on to just another product that we were working on. We haven't done any work on it recently, which is called Hypnolumiere, which is essentially a 60 watt. It's about the size of an angle poised lamp, full of color, which can entrain you into a hypnagogic state within about 30 seconds. But that's something else entirely. I mean, there's no feedback there. It's just bludgeoning you into a particular state if you want to go there.
Using a flashing light.
Using a flashing light, 60 LEDs, so 61 watt LEDs. Quite powerful.
Red LEDs or multicolored?
RGB. I mean, there are 5 very strong white ones in the array, but the rest are RGB. So you can choose what colors you want, and they're in segments, so you can change it. But essentially, that's, if you like, that's a kind of very much an experimental product. What we're trying to do at the moment is obviously help in terms of EMDR, but in doing so, we've also got the whole concept of linking the EEG into that and providing these 3 different tools for flashing, if I can put it that way. Doesn't sound particularly good, never mind. Essentially EMDR, AVE, and this whole kind of Alzheimer's thing. Perhaps, Paul, it might be a good idea for you just to sort of jump in there and say a bit about that.
Okay, yes. Okay, I'll jump in there. I was looking at various things to do with light with Steve, and I came up with a interesting research which was done in 2020 by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And what they were doing were exposing mice who had been genetically programmed to have Alzheimer's. And they were stimulating them with LED lights in their cages at 40 flashes per second for 1 hour per day. And then they did some studies, microscopic studies on their brains, and they were amazed to find that what's called the beta amyloids and the tau proteins were 50% reduced after 2 weeks of doing this. And those 2 proteins are affected, are higher in Alzheimer's and in Parkinson's. And they found also that it boosted the activity of what's called microgyria, or microglial cells. And they're clearing cells that get rid of the harmful debris that builds up in the hippocampus and the auditory cortex in patients with Alzheimer's. And that was also, and another thing they found was that it reduced what's called the aniline aminotransferase, and that's seen in the liver in people who are drinking too much. So it seems that 40 hertz red flash is quite a magic frequency to be using. So my idea is to be using, like Steve was saying, is to go into gamma entrainment, which will not only help with memory improvement, but also mood and cognition improvements. And would start off with a flashing light at, say, alpha range 10, and then would go up to 20, 40, and then stay at 40 with a red light, and do that with some feedback to the patient or client in your case, and see when we measure from, and I'd measure from FZ, CZ, PZ, and OZ, and we'd see the biggest changes at the back, but also I'd like to record from the front to see if it affects the precortex. And one aside from all of that, but I found out just recently that eating pistachio nuts increases your gamma frequencies.
I read that too. That's pretty funny.
Yeah.
If it's coherent gamma.
Well, that's the case. So I'll be even using midline electrodes, or I might use both sides to look for symmetries as well. But that's my next step of using Steve's equipment.
Yes, I mean, I think this whole by now treasure trove of information on 40 hertz gamma is talking coherence, and I should think that that I assume a flashing light at 40 hertz frequencies would promote coherence just by definition, in terms of brain balancing. If both sides of the brain are watching it or being affected by it, the pulsation of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how are you using it, Paul? You say you're using it Tell a little bit more about that in your practice for therapeutic purposes, and are people hooked to the mind mirror at all?
Well, it's still in its infancy at the moment. This is what I'm doing in my spare time when I'm not working in the hospital. So looking into that side as well. So it's very much research at the moment and seeing what we get. But looking forward to having chat. Hello?
Paul or Steve, has anybody been looking at linking this also with heart coherence rather than just EEG?
Well, I mean, essentially, structured breathing at the same time as doing EEG and ABE would obviously increase heart coherence.
Well, yeah, that's the usual approach, but what if we associated the lights with the heart coherence as well?
So strobing
instead of.
Okay.
I know it's a whole
how
different
you'd want to do
question.
that.
What? Why would we want to do that?
Well, I mean, more importantly, how would we do it? What would you base the frequency on? The pulse?
Well, the HRV. Just like heart math would do it.
I wonder if you're thinking, Gary, about the heart coherence according to heart math being at 0.1 hertz.
Exactly.
Flashing at 0.1 hertz would be very slow. I mean, you'd be once every 10 seconds.
Yeah, it would be very slow. Of course, there are different frequencies in the heart rate variability, some faster and some slower, depending on what's happening in the autonomic system, sympathetic or parasympathetic. So, yeah, I don't know. Just a thought, just tossing it out to see if anybody's thought about trying that.
It's certainly possible to obviously have very slow flashing, but I'm not sure that a flash every 10 seconds is likely to cause any kind of entrainment at all. It's more likely to issue a startle response, I would have thought, or an anticipatory response, because it's happening very, very regularly almost.
Yeah. There's some issues there. So just a thought. See if anybody.
You could have a subdominant beat. I mean, you could be pulsing at 10 and then have a second source of light pulsing at 0.1. I mean, I don't know what effect that would have, but
it depends. I mean, we're moving into some fairly experimental territory now. I mean, I don't know how many people have ever tried low frequency sound therapy where you've got you're being hit with low frequency sound waves from a large amplifier at between 16 and 30 hertz, and that according to these people, every part of the body has a resonant frequency, so you can either tighten or loosen particular muscles using particular frequencies.
So this is Garth. I'm using that system and have been using it for about 6 months with clients and myself. I've got it's called the vibroacoustical therapy system. I'm sitting on it right now. It's in my chair, and I've corresponded with Lee Bartell, who's the guy that did some of that original things. He's got a YouTube thing about the Alzheimer's. I've corresponded with him recently over the last couple of months. So I'm using it with clients in my office for PTSD and physical pain, actually, which it has reduced the physical pain. It definitely helps my back. So I've also got a light, 40 hertz white light. There's a 40 hertz little gadget that you can put around your neck and hear it with earbuds. I'm playing with that a lot. I have included the vibration along with the David Delight, where you're using the flashing lights along with the 40 hertz pulse, and that's gotten really good results also. At least that, and I'm just beginning to do that. The David Delight I've had for 3 years, the sound pulse, I came across that 25 years ago and had my own system way back then and got away from it. So that's what I'm doing here in Wisconsin.
So you have kind of a multi-layer thing going there.
I do. I'm trying to mix and match some of this, and I haven't pulled the mind mirror in yet. That's on the horizon sometime in the future.
So your clients are finding relaxation and pain reduction?
Yes. And I use it with, I've got one Iraq veterans, and then there was a big explosion in a factory here 6 weeks ago. So I've got 2 people with PTSD that I'm doing the sound and vibrational and light therapy with a voiceover where I can put my voice in and do a guided imagery along with all the things that are going on, hitting all their different systems, the visual, the auditory, and the kinesthetic all at once. That's what I've been saying. Yeah.
You sound like an orchestra conductor there, Garth.
Sometimes it feels like it.
Who is a social worker there in Wisconsin. You know, we have several comments and questions here in chat. I know that there's lots more that each of you has to share, but maybe I can throw these in right now. From Peter Tavernese, speaking of binaural beats, I'm curious when we get to Q&A, has anyone, Stephen, used the LED strobe and sound frequency audio to the subject connected with EEG to see if you can guide to specific brain frequencies faster, more reliably? I think that's basically what you were saying. Yes, Steve?
Yeah, I mean, we were working with some people out in the Middle East, in fact, still are, but COVID has got in the way quite dramatically. Working with severely autistic kids who basically live in Delta. And one of the things is using EEG and sound, because obviously flashing lights might be a bit too harsh for kids with autism. Using sound and EEG to remove them from sort of the delta into progressively through theta into beta via alpha. So that's a project that's actually ongoing and is getting decent results.
Fantastic. That's fantastic. And then from Paula Puglisi, she says, are you familiar with or use the David Delight or brain tap devices, which use audio and visual entrainment as well as transcranial electric stimulation clinically?
Perfect. Well, I personally wouldn't want to attach electronic electrodes to my ears and then blast a current across, however small it is. That's not something I really don't want to do, but I understand that other people do it and it is safe. But certainly there are a number of products out there. MindPlace, for example, do ABE products. The David Delight, the guy who did that is very knowledgeable. And then there's the Roshi, which I'm not sure whether that's still produced, but that was very trippy and very expensive about 20 years ago.
Paula, do you want to weigh in here and say a little bit more about that? Transcranial, whether people are getting electrified or it's working?
I don't use it. That's why I'm asking, because I tend to be want more organic results. So I don't want to really entrain anybody. I try to guide the brain to what's optimal for that individual brain. One of the things, though, I have used is something called the Vilistus, which is transcranial LED entrainment. So, I mean, you're not seeing that flash, but your brain is responding to it. So it just sits on the head, and it's either alpha, it vibrates or it stimulates at alpha, or either gamma. And I did use that one for a guy that had a really severe AV malformation bleed in his brainstem, to try to maybe encourage some of those byproducts of metabolism that were the glial cells really needed to deal with. And I did see results with that, as well as doing neurofeedback training with him.
Cool. Carolyn McMakin says, Marianne said that Carolyn McMakin with frequency-specific microcurrent, FSM, has a 100% success rate with PTSD, including incurable cases. It takes about 8 weeks. She has YouTubes if you want to check it out. Microcurrent, how is that different with what we're talking about here? Or is that a form of transcranial stimulation?
No, there are electrodes that you put on. You just need to make sure you have a contact with wet towels or whatever, and it's microamps, 100 microamps, and you can't feel it. And she has incredible success. The frequency specific you have to take a course before you can use it. It's really complex, but she has this wonderful success rate. I like to tell people about it in case they want to investigate it.
Okay.
It does sound like transcranial stimulation, but
Well, except the one towel is on your neck and the other one's on your waist. They stay away from the head.
And then Paula also commented that Persinger was using 40 hertz stimulation in his God helmet. Yeah, so what are you going to do with this? Are you going to develop a 40 hertz product, Paul?
I'm certainly looking into it, yeah. Out of interest is transcranial stimulation. I work in theatre where we monitor the motor pathways down through the spine to the feet. And for that, I put screw electrodes into the scalp, and then I give the anesthetized patient something in the order of 20 microvolts and 200 volts. And you need to be that high for it to penetrate through the skull. And that makes the body jump. So I'm wondering with these microcurrents, how much of that signal actually just transfers from one electrode to the other one through the skin and not into the brain at all.
Something to check out. But you're saying that you're not doing a 40 hertz strobe. That's not the product that you're doing. You're thinking of doing transcranial?
Paul and I are talking about doing something with Vilistus and either glasses or a box or a bar.
Well, that would be going back to what Max said in the first place, that you can stimulate the awakened mind with this work, with the strobe. I had a crazy experience one time, and Geoff is actually talking about somebody, a fellow who invented something called the brainwave synchronizer. And I was a reporter who had a column in a newspaper about interesting things. And this guy came over to my house and he had this AVE, and this was, I'd never heard of it, seen it before. But it was glasses and sound through earbuds or headphones. And the guy didn't know what he was doing. He had just gotten this and apparently hadn't studied it very much. And when he turned it on, apparently he had it on an extremely high setting in terms of hertz. And I saw this blur of white and then this extraordinarily sharp image where I was standing on a balcony of a glass skyscraper sometime thousands of years in the future. So apparently there's going to be a future. And all the buildings were glass. And I was just looking out, and there was this incredible sense of peace. I mean, this image was just absolutely seared into my brain. And then I heard the guy say, uh-oh, uh-oh. And he turned the knob the opposite direction. And then I was out on a seashore, just listening to quiet waves. So AVE may be intended for the tamest uses of relaxation, but if you guys start putting in some high frequencies, I think it would be extremely interesting to see what happens, especially because of these studies with the Monroe Institute. We know people are traveling out of body. There's no question, in gamma, and doing remote viewing in gamma. If you add in some super high frequencies, I don't know, maybe people will quit doing psychotropic drugs and turn to your AVE instead, because it's incredibly powerful technology. And I see why Max, with his metaphysical side, was so interested in it, not just for certainly for self-discovery, especially because what one of you said is that the brain will try to make sense of all these shimmering colors and lights and tell a story. And maybe that's going to be a story about something that's self-referential, or maybe they're going to look through some portal and have some kind of crazy vision like I did.
I do have one. I mean, it's one story that the Hypnoliving product, the thing I mentioned that was the angle poison lamp with the 60 LEDs. We released this. We actually announced it at a conference in Rome 3 or 4 years ago, and set it up in the foyer so that people could try it out. And people would just come in, sit down, close their eyes, and we would just flash these lights at them. And our experience was that, without exception, all the guys loved it. They would sort of basically relaxed, and they were just away really quickly. 10, 15 seconds, they were gone. But what we did find is that a large proportion of the women that tried it knocked it away very quickly. And my rationalization for that is that because it was such a strong entrainment device, that it just drove through any kind of defense you had against external forces. And my way of describing this is that kind of we build a sort of onion rings of defense, women especially, because of history and other stuff. And this stuff just drove straight through it. And it was just too strong for a lot of people.
Or women's brains were more balanced to begin with.
That also is possible.
One of the things that another story, I know of some research that's not published using the V light, and they were using it for say St. Young and Kalausa, people who were apparently considered to be awakened, enlightened, and so on. Many years of meditation. When they use the V light, there's a version of the V light that's not available commercially, which allows you to adjust the frequency of light, which is being shined in through the skull and the red lights. And they would play with it until they would hit a sweet spot. And they would say, oh, this is exactly where I want to be when I'm, in that very enlightened, ecumenics state, exactly where everybody should be. And they could adjust the light to drive themselves into that state. Whereas I've listened to Dan Brown discussing, he's done a lot of research in this area, and he's also very, let's say, enlightened, as the word goes, that when they attempt to do neurofeedback on him and do the neurofeedback back to driving the areas of the brain that they thought, were involved with enlightenment or awakened mind or whatever you want to call it, it kicked him out of it because he could go into it on his own. But as soon as they attempted to do the neurofeedback to bring them into that state, they lost it. So there's, this strange kind of balance between how much the brain can be driven into a particular state and where it needs to go to be in that sweet spot. Research has not really been published yet, but it's, very suggestive of things that, we might be interested in.
Yeah,
Sounds to
which
me
makes
like,
me, go ahead.
oh, sorry. Yeah, it just sounds to me like there's a defense mechanism kicking in there that just stops you from doing something, being pushed into something that you want to do, but you don't want someone else to do to you.
Possible. Which actually brings me to a question, Steve. For this device that you and Paul are gonna, I guess, co-develop, is that what, if I understood that correctly? Yeah.
If Paul is willing to work with me, absolutely.
Well, why not?
We forged a marriage right here on the IM webinar.
Oh.
So my hope is that that there would be some control so people could decide what frequencies they want to concentrate the light at. Yeah. Rather than have the auto kind of thing try to drive you down somewhere where, even if you need to go there.
I think there are two ways of using this. One is a manual, which is, I want to go there, please take me there. And the other one, which with people who just want to experience it, it's quite easy just to, as I say, put the electrodes on and just let the lights, the lights become a feedback rather than a feed forward at that point. So they're enhancing the feedback. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I mean, we have that facility in the pattern editor where we can design our own brainwave patterns and use auto augment and auto inhibit so that this feed forward concept is working. I mean, I think that's common in neurofeedback. Yeah.
Yeah, completely.
Why don't I ask if anybody else has any questions that haven't appeared in the chat? Now would be a good time for that.
And if anyone wants to ask questions later or got any comments, then everyone knows my email address.
Yes. Or you can write me and I can forward your email. I'm really sorry that that the results of the studies that Max was doing, however unobtrusively, were not written down, because that would be some really wonderful information to have. I'm happy that Geoff did write down what he did. And I think, Neil, if it's okay with you, we can post that, let people download and read that document.
Yeah, I did circulate it, I think, to a few people to begin with. And if nobody sees any issues with that, I think it's, it wasn't something that I think Geoff was in the process of, so I don't know how far it got, but it certainly seems to me to be a reasonable summary of that. But I'm just throwing it open, partly if anybody's read it and thinks that it's not a good idea, to speak up now.
I'd be happy to post it as a PDF that can be downloaded. And somehow I've just remembered that this document has some rather poetic things that people have written. Do you want to hear one of them? It's pretty short. All right, it's by somebody who actually was a writer. Or maybe not, just says one student, how the strobe stimulated imagination. It's obviously titled Strobe. Flame, leaping in wonder to unearthly fire, an all-engulfing pyre, a burning cleansing of the past's dark shame. The swirling color, the breathless ecstasy, the hint of fear, of all the hidden unknown that lies far back in the primeval past. I only know that long ago, those flames engulfed, the spirit upward flew. But now the earth and I are old. The ecstasy of the dim remembered past sweeps by so fast, and winter's cold is dark and near. I do not dare to rise, And yet I know, did I look beyond the skies, so far above, beyond the winter snows, that gleam of love, the Christ light, Buddha light, whatever, glows. That is by B.S. Strathmiglo, Scotland. Bought something from deep, saw forward, saw backward. Yeah, I can imagine that the power of the strobe is pretty infinite. And Geoff says this in this paper. If you read it, you'll see that he's basically saying that it is stimulating the visual cortex, but clearly the visual cortex is connected to all parts of the brain, and that what people bring to the experience is going to make the experience unique to them. And it may travel to other people, or maybe it's just something you yourself need to see or feel. So I hope you enjoyed my rather dramatic reading of that little poem. And if there are no other questions, I guess we can close and promise to meet again if Steve and Paul develop something that we want to take a look at, which I have no doubt will be the case. Sound good? Any last questions? Last call?
I have a question.
Okay, Paula?
Sorry, because I did ask questions before, but I have a client that I'm working with now, an addictive client who's in the residential treatment facility, and I did a QEEG on him, and he had some very brief spike and wave activity. So I sent him for a sleep-deprived EEG, which isn't back yet, but really interesting guy. He tells me that, you know, he loses time. He has out-of-body experiences where he sees himself, like he was standing doing dishes and he could see himself and thought, oh, you have a spot on the back of your shorts. He also has experiences where he gets visual imagery of events that haven't happened, and he knows that they're going to happen in the future. And he said they're not important events. They'll be like, oh, he's in construction and he was working on an asphalt road, and he was working with someone that he had never worked with before, and he had seen him either months or years before and knew that this event was going to happen. So I'm wondering how many seizure patients maybe are just unable to control that travel that they do. And, you know, if they put this guy on anticonvulsants, is he going to lose that ability rather than just teaching him to be able to control it? I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Sounds like a question for you, Paul.
Yeah, I would say if you can, look at the screen of the raw trace of your QEEG and see what frequency the spike and wave is at, and whether it starts on any particular electrode, especially if it's T3 or T4, which would suggest a temporal lobe attack, which can give you that kind of aura.
So it's at C3, I believe, and it was about 6 hertz.
Okay, that's unusual frequency to have spike and wave rather than just polyspikes. And what I'd like to see a screenshot of that. If you'd like to send it to me, I'll tell you what I think of it.
Okay, thank you.
I'll be happy to forward that to him,
Yeah.
Paul, if you want to send it to me.
Thanks.
I wonder if he's got a parietal lobe issue, because that parietal lobe is what gives us our sense of where we are in time and space and inside our skin. Isn't C3 parietal?
I'm pretty sure it was C3. I mean, I'd have to go back and look at it. It was very brief. It was only about 3 spikes in a row. In fact, I do like an auto artifactor, which didn't pick it up, but I saw it as I was doing his cue. And so I went back and, you know, looked at it more closely, and it was definitely spike and wave, and it was there. So, and he had just come into us when I did his cue. He was living in the woods and not really sleeping very well. So, I mean, is it something that they'll be able to reproduce? I don't know, but but he, you know, he did tell me many instances of seeing himself and also like these premonitions that he had.
Some people would pay for that experience.
Yeah, certainly spikes or spike and wave on the C electrodes tends to happen more in children than adults. You tend to get it more in children who have seizures in their sleep. So I'm not sure how that relates, rather than picking it up more into the temporal lobe. But we'll have a look and see what I think.
Well, it has been a tremendous pleasure to have you guys here. You know, as I said at the start, we love finding out what was happening when Max and Geoff were creating their magic and exploring consciousness, which was, you know, other than in the Eastern religions or philosophies, unmapped pretty much back then, except for that's it. I mean, you had Joe, who recently died. What's his name? I've suddenly lost it. Who the great neurofeedback guy who was, yes, thank you, who was training Alpha in the United States. And certainly there were hypnotists all over the world who knew things, but in terms of just exploring, experimenting and tracking the effect on EEG, these guys were the frontiersmen. So it's wonderful to be able to reach back and find out what was actually going on. And if any of you happens to remember anything, please let us know, and we can tack a little piece onto this webinar or send out some information. And we appreciate your yesteryear people being there with us, being here with us, and also Steve and Paul, you two guys, letting us know what's going on with stroboscopic flickering these days. So I guess we will flicker off now with these thanks, and to all of you who attended as well. Thank you. Thank you for being
Very
here.
nice to hear what's happening, and nice to meet everybody again.
Absolutely.
Bye-bye.
Meet you now. See you next time. Bye now.